What are your top 3 tips for somebody writing a speech?
In no particular order, I would say think very, very hard about your audience and also about what you hope and expect to get from this speech.
So does that mean you have a call to action of some sort?
You may do. You may have to try and research who they are, who's coming. Try and work out what do they think already, and what are you trying to do? Are you trying to persuade them of something new, or are you trying to get them to leave the room and do something different? So you've got to think, what's my reasonable expectation for this speech? And that will then begin to govern the selection of material. Secondly, I would think really hard about your central proposition. If you were to reduce this speech to a single line, what would that line be? And until you know that, and until that is a proposition, not just a general statement, a general phrase, you don't know where you're going with it.
Which could, by the way, reflect on a policy you're trying to promote.
It probably will.
A false, not as strong a proposition in and of itself.
Well, that's exactly right, because you always discover when you speak for 20 minutes whether you've got anything to say or not. It's quite easy to speak for 20 minutes with nothing to say, but you don't get away with it. And you don't kid yourself either. You know that an argument is weak when you try and expound it at length. So I would spend a lot of time making sure your central proposition is as tight as it can be. And then the third thing is I say this to all, I do a lot of corporate writing as well, and I always go into them and say, right, let's make a list of all those words which you use at work, which you'd never dream of using at home or in the pub talking to friends. Let's write them all down, and then let's never say any of them ever again. Because the internal vernacular, the professional jargon, is really depressing and dispiriting and is not an aid to communication. It's a way people make themselves feel as though they belong to the profession they're in.
And so to the exclusion of others.
To the exclusion of others, and it's not an aid to communication. So I get rid of all of that, and I try and implore people to write as plainly as they possibly can. The poetry from a good speech doesn't come from the $10 words. It comes from the compression. It comes from binding them together into an argument which then has a poetic force. Okay. So don't be flowery.
Okay, so audience, core, and cliches.
Yeah.
And now 3 tips for people who are delivering your speech. When you're sitting there going, you shouldn't have said it that way. What are the tips you give for somebody in delivery?
Well, first, before you even get there, you've got to rehearse properly. Because the best editing you'll ever do is when you stand up there and speak it. So rehearse it, say it out loud, and then go back to your text first and cut it, but also then mark the text with emphasis and stress.
How important is memorization?
Ideally, if you can, I think it's that was going to be
It makes a difference.
It makes a difference. My second tip would be, if you possibly can, if you've got time, then try and memorize at least some of it. I always insist people memorize the opening, because your opening should set the whole thing up, and I want that to be exactly right. I don't want that to be meandering. And I also want them, for the same reason, to remember perfectly the ending. Mm-hmm. So you've got to end with a flourish. Open with a flourish, end with a flourish. If you want to meander a bit in the middle, that's okay. But if you can remember it all, it's far much better. Thirdly, though, a really good way of doing a speech is to transfer it onto cards. Because if you've prepared properly, and if you've written well, and spent the time that you should have spent writing it, then you'll have a very good sense of the journey that the speech takes. You can transfer that onto cards in such a way that a single word will act as a prompt for a whole paragraph. Then if you've got it on cards, if you've not got the luxury of an autocue, you can have a card there, you look down briefly, pause, that looks like stature.
He's thinking.
He's thinking. The audience likes that.
I've forgotten my speech is what you're really thinking.
Yes, you are, but you've got that there, and then you look up and you deliver. And that gives you a real sense of authority at the podium, which people are always frightened that they lack. So that's how I'd suggest people do it.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.